When I speak about the early years of my life, my voice sometimes trembles, not because I am weak, but because the memories still hold a sharpness that time has never managed to dull. At 70 years old, sitting in my small home in rural Oregon with the scent of old pine and worn books around me, I finally allow myself to return to the beginning, back to the days when my name was Eleanor Brooks, a wide-eyed 20-year-old girl living in a quiet farming town in Indiana, believing the world was gentle and full of promise. I remember that version of myself with an ache that sits just below my ribs, the ache of innocence that did not know it was about to be shattered. Back then, my life revolved around a young man named Benjamin Clark. He was everything pure and steady, the kind of man who smelled faintly of fresh-cut wood because he worked long hours as a carpenter. His hands were rough, but when they held mine, I felt as though the world softened. He didn't have land or money or even a car that worked on cold mornings, but he had sincerity, and at 20, sincerity felt like enough to build a whole life upon. We spent evenings sitting near the old riverbank, our legs touching lightly, the water reflecting the peach-colored sunsets that only Indiana summers could paint. Benjamin would talk about the little workshop he wanted to open one day, a place where he could build furniture from scraps other people threw away. I would imagine myself cooking in a small house with creaky floors, sunlight streaming through thin curtains, Benjamin humming while sanding a cradle he dreamed of building for our first child. But in that same house where I dreamed quietly, my father Richard Brooks dreamed very differently for me. He was a man of business, numbers, negotiations, and a rigid spine forged by years of hauling his family from poverty into middle-class comfort. To him, emotion was a liability, something that distracted from ambition. He believed the future should be built strategically, not romantically. I was his only daughter, and in his mind, that meant I was his greatest asset. Every time he saw me come home smiling from my time with Benjamin, his jaw tightened. Every time I spoke of wanting a simple life, his eyes darkened with something between frustration and disbelief. My father had another man in mind for me, Harold Whitmore, the eldest son of the wealthiest textile mill family in the county. Harold was nearly 10 years older than I was, always dressed in pressed shirts that smelled of cologne too strong for my liking. He had a way of staring at people as though he were evaluating a piece of property, deciding whether to buy or discard it. I never once saw warmth in his expression, only entitlement. Yet in my father's eyes, Harold represented security, expansion, and the sort of marriage that could strengthen his business alliances for decades. When my father first mentioned Harold as a potential husband, I laughed nervously, thinking it was some misguided attempt to nudge me toward better prospects. But when I declined politely, my father's composure cracked. He started talking about stability, reputation, and how marrying someone poor would anchor me to a life of struggle. I tried explaining that struggle meant little when you loved the person beside you, but he dismissed my words with a wave of his hand, as though youth blinded me to logic. In the weeks that followed, conversations became confrontations. My father would argue late into the night, insisting that I was being childish, irresponsible, and ungrateful. He said choosing Benjamin meant throwing away every advancement he'd worked for. I remember him slamming his fist on the dinner table one night, silverware jumping from the force, while he shouted that no daughter of his would settle for mediocrity. My mother stayed silent, her eyes flicking between us, but she never intervened. Perhaps she feared him too. Perhaps she believed he knew best. Benjamin noticed the tension and asked me gently if my father disliked him. I lied, not wanting to burden him with the truth, telling him it was just the stress of my father's business dealings. Benjamin wasn't a man to pry, so he let it go, though I could see the worry in the tight way he held my hand. We continued meeting in secret places behind the old mill, near the riverbank, in the grassy field behind his workshop. We made promises there, whispered dreams there, and slowly built a world that felt separate from the one my father ruled. But my father was not a man easily defied. He began forbidding me from leaving the house, ordering one of his employees to drive me everywhere. He cut off my access to money, limited my errands, and lectured me daily on the responsibilities of being a Brooks. Each new restriction made Benjamin feel further away, even when he was physically near. I clung to our love like it was the last warm thing in a winter storm.
Then came the night that marked the end of my innocence.
A thunderstorm was raging outside, heavy rain beating against the windows, thunder shaking the walls. My father asked me to sit with him in the dining room, a single candle flickering between us because the power had gone out. He spoke calmly, too calmly, reminding me again that the Brooks name depended on the choices I made. I argued back, refusing Harold, insisting I would marry Benjamin or no one. My father's face changed. Something cold, something frightening passed through it. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten. He just stood up, walked away, and left me sitting there with the uneasy sense that something irreversible had just shifted. Even now, 5 decades later, I can still recall the exact sound of thunder that followed him out of the room and the way I felt a chill crawl up my spine, as though my future was slipping quietly into the darkness outside. That storm was the last night I ever knew the world as a safe place. Because from that moment on, my father was no longer trying to persuade me. He was preparing to break me. I used to believe that the worst pain a person could feel came from heartbreak, from losing someone they loved or being abandoned in a moment of need. But I learned very quickly at the age of 20, that there are wounds far deeper than loneliness, wounds carved not into the flesh but into the very foundation of one's dignity. And the most devastating part was that the man who inflicted that wound on me was my own father. Even now, at 70, when I think back on what happened, I feel my hands tremble slightly, and I find myself gripping the arms of my rocking chair to steady the memories long buried beneath decades of silence. The morning after that stormy argument, I woke with a strange heaviness behind my eyes and an unease I couldn't quite name. My father behaved unusually gentle during breakfast, speaking in a tone that felt rehearsed, as though he had already decided something and was waiting for the right moment to reveal it. My mother kept her gaze lowered, pushing her food around her plate without taking a single bite. Benjamin's name hung in the air, like a forbidden word neither of my parents dared to utter. I remember trying to excuse myself, wanting to step outside into the crisp Indiana air to clear my head, but my father insisted I stay for dinner later that evening, saying he had an important matter he wished to settle once and for all. Something in the firmness of his voice made my heart tighten. I almost didn't go downstairs that night. A part of me sensed danger, the kind that hums quietly under the skin, telling you that the world outside your room may never look the same if you step into it. But I was still young, still hopeful enough to believe that even a strict father had limits. I could not have imagined how wrong I was. Dinner was simple: roasted chicken, carrots, mashed potatoes, but the atmosphere was thick, almost suffocating. My father poured me a glass of wine, something he rarely allowed, saying a celebration was in order because his daughter was finally coming to her senses. I refused the drink at first, but he insisted, claiming it would steady my nerves. I took a few sips to appease him, though something tasted slightly bitter beneath the sweetness. My mother's spoon clattered softly against her bowl when she heard him speak, and when I glanced at her, she turned away quickly, her shoulders tense, as if bracing for something she couldn't stop. The room felt heavier with every breath. My father spoke about duty, honor, and the importance of making choices that aligned with the family's future. He talked as though Benjamin were a childish fantasy and Harold a destiny I was too naive to appreciate. I remember trying to argue back, but my tongue felt sluggish, like my thoughts were being pulled underwater. A warm, dizzying sensation washed over me, and the candlelight on the table began to blur into long streaks. The last thing I saw before the world dimmed was my father's face, calm, composed, and terribly certain. When I woke, the air felt cold against my skin. I couldn't move at first, my limbs heavy and unresponsive, as though my body belonged to someone else. I blinked repeatedly until the room sharpened into focus. It wasn't my bedroom.
It wasn't anywhere familiar.
The walls were bare. The curtains were drawn. A faint buzzing sound echoed in my ears, and fear surged through me before I fully understood why. My wrists and ankles were secured, my voice muffled when I tried to speak. My head spun violently with confusion, disbelief, and a rising terror that made it hard to breathe. Then the door opened. My father stepped inside, his expression unreadable, neither angry nor remorseful, simply determined. He didn't scold me or yell. He didn't say I had brought this on myself. He spoke with the detached tone of a man discussing a business contract that required a signature. He told me that he had made arrangements that would guarantee my future, our family's reputation, and ensure the Brooks name remained aligned with the wealthiest power in the county. His voice never once wavered. I tried to shake my head, tried to scream behind the cloth that silenced me, but my body didn't respond the way I wanted. A fog still clouded my mind, leaving my thoughts scattered like broken glass. My father carried a small medical kit, the kind used by a traveling nurse or a clinic worker. I remember the metallic gleam of the tools under the dim light, the cold precision of the preparations he made, and the horrifying realization that whatever was about to happen, I had no power to stop it. He said I would thank him one day. He said love was a fleeting thing, but alliances built empires, and marriages secured them. What he forced upon me wasn't violent in the way people imagine violence, but it was a violation of something far more sacred: my choice, my autonomy, my right to determine the course of my own life. He imposed a future onto me without my consent, binding me permanently to Harold's world before I had any say in the matter.
I lay there helpless, tears slipping down the sides of my face, soaking into the thin pillow beneath my head.
I remember staring at the ceiling, counting the cracks in the plaster just to keep from collapsing inward. When it was over, my father removed the cloth from my mouth and loosened the restraints.
The numbness in my limbs made it hard to sit up.
He stood at the foot of the bed like a judge delivering a sentence and told me I was no longer free to choose. The decision had been made for me. My path had been corrected. Then he walked away, leaving me trembling, ashamed, and shattered in a room that would forever haunt my memory. I don't know how long I remained there after he left. Minutes? Hours? Time had lost meaning. By the time I managed to stand, I could barely support my own weight. I felt as though the ground beneath me had cracked open, swallowing the girl I once was. In the days that followed, I withdrew into myself, too frightened and humiliated to tell anyone, not even Benjamin. But secrets have a way of surfacing, especially when the body begins to change in ways no amount of denial can hide. When I finally discovered I was pregnant, the truth hit me with such force that I collapsed onto the bathroom floor, clutching my stomach, sobbing into my hands. And yet, despite the terror twisting inside me, I still hoped Benjamin would believe me, hoped that love would be enough to hold us together. I went to him trembling, desperate, praying he would see the truth in my eyes. I told him everything, every agonizing detail of the night that stole my future. But when he looked at me, his gaze drifted to the slight curve of my belly, and something broke inside him. He didn't shout. He didn't accuse. He just whispered, in a voice cracked with disbelief, that sometimes people lie to protect themselves, and maybe I was doing the same. He said the child was proof of my betrayal, not my father's. I watched him walk away, the man I loved more than anything disappearing down a dusty gravel road without looking back. In that moment, I realized my father hadn't just taken my freedom, had taken Benjamin too, the last fragment of hope I had left. Standing in the fading light of that Indiana afternoon, I understood that my life had been redirected by force, and nothing would ever return to what it had been.
The girl by the riverbank was gone.
And in her place was someone I barely recognized, someone carrying a future she never chose. The day my father announced my engagement to Harold Whitmore, I felt as if the air had been sucked out of the room. I stood there, frozen, Like someone else was living my life for me and I was merely a spectator trapped behind the glass. At 20 years old, pregnancy beginning to quietly anchor itself inside me, and the man I loved gone from my world, I had no strength left to fight anything anymore. My father's victory was absolute. In his eyes, I had become what he wanted: submissive, quiet, and resigned. But in reality, I was simply empty, a hollow shell drifting through days without direction. I wish I could say the wedding was beautiful or that some part of me still held a faint spark of hope, but all I remember from that morning in the Grand Methodist Church in Indianapolis was the weight of the white dress on my shoulders, like a shroud rather than a bridal gown. My veil felt suffocating, my shoes too tight, the perfume I wore too sweet, cloying in my throat until I nearly gagged. My mother dabbed a tear from her eye before the ceremony, but I couldn't tell if it came from sadness, guilt, or relief that the ordeal was nearly over. Harold stood at the altar with a posture that screamed entitlement: broad shoulders, slicked back hair, eyes scanning me with the self-satisfied gaze of a man who believed he had acquired something valuable. His smile wasn't joyful. It was triumphant. When he took my hand, his grip tightened just a little too firmly, as though claiming ownership in front of the entire congregation. The reception that followed was extravagant beyond anything I'd ever experienced: crystal chandeliers, classical string music, tables draped with silk, and polished guests who congratulated Harold far more than they congratulated me. They treated me like an ornament, a beautiful addition to Harold's growing collection of achievements. Every time someone clinked their glass and told me I was lucky, I felt the words burn against my chest. There was no luck in the path I'd been forced down. Just inevitability. After the last guest left and the music faded, Harold escorted me into the large guesthouse on his family estate, the place that would become my new home. The house was immaculate, spotless, and cold. The floors echoed under my feet, and every piece of furniture was chosen by someone else, placed by someone else, and meant to please someone else. It didn't feel like a home, it felt like a showroom. My new life began with Harold closing the door behind us, locking it with a soft click that settled into my bones like a warning. The first months of marriage revealed Harold's true nature with a cruelty so steady it felt almost methodical. He was not physically violent, not at first, but he exercised control with the precision of a man accustomed to getting exactly what he wanted. He criticized how I dressed, how I spoke, how I walked. He demanded obedience in small things first, like how I arranged the breakfast table or how I folded his shirts. When I failed to meet his expectations, he unleashed a temper that left me shaking. He didn't need his hands to break me, his words cut deep enough. He would belittle my intelligence, mock my past with Benjamin, and remind me daily how fortunate I should feel to be married into wealth. But wealth did not warm a bed, nor soften a heart. Harold's house felt like a gilded cage from the moment I stepped inside, and every passing week tightened the bars around me. When Mason was born, me beautiful boy with dark eyes and soft curls, something inside me flickered to life again. Holding him against my chest for the first time, feeling the fragile rise and fall of his tiny breaths, I finally understood what it meant to love something so fiercely you'd give up your entire world to protect it. I whispered promises into his little ear, that I would keep him safe, that he would never know the truth of how he came to be, that someday, somehow, I would give him a better life. But Harold saw Mason differently. At first, he paraded him around the estate like a trophy. But as the novelty faded, so did his patience. He would grow irritated when Mason cried, annoyed when I focused too much attention on the baby, angered if dinner wasn't ready because Mason needed me. Harold's resentment simmered into hostility, and slowly his temper turned into something more physical. A slammed door near my face. A shoved chair that nearly hit Mason. A bruising grip on my arm when he felt I wasn't listening well enough. Every act chipped away at the last remnants of my spirit. By the time Mason turned 4, Harold no longer bothered to hide his aggression. He raised his voice freely, hurled insults without remorse, and on nights when business stressed him, he took out his anger on whatever or whoever was closest. I learned to read the twitch of his jaw, the narrowing of his eyes, the slight shift in his breathing. Those were signs that danger was near. But Mason, my sweet little boy, didn't have the same instincts. He didn't understand the storm building inside Harold. One night, Harold's rage escalated into something more terrifying than anything I had seen before. A business deal had failed, and he came home drinking more than usual. He shouted at me for the dinner being cold, then accused me of intentionally disrespecting him. When I tried to calm him, he grabbed my wrist so forcefully it left dark marks that lingered for days. Mason toddled into the room, frightened by the noise, his little voice trembling as he called out for me. Instead of softening Harold, it enraged him. He turned toward Mason with a glare that chilled me to the core. I stepped between them, shielding my child with my body, and for the first time, Harold raised his hand as if ready to strike me. Something inside me snapped that night, not from fear, but from clarity. I realized that staying in that house meant condemning my son to a childhood filled with violence and terror. For years, I had accepted my own suffering, believing I had no escape. But the thought of Harold's anger touching Mason awakened a strength I didn't know I possessed. I began saving, secretly tucking away small bills from grocery funds, selling bits of jewelry Harold never noticed, hiding emergency supplies under loose floorboards. I studied Harold's routines, memorized the times he traveled for work, learned which nights he drank enough to sleep deeply. I planned quietly, carefully, desperately. The breaking point came when Mason was 5. Harold's rage erupted over a misplaced document in his study. His shouts echoed through the house, and when he grabbed me by the shoulders and shook me hard enough to rattle my teeth, I saw Mason standing in the doorway, eyes wide with terror, his tiny hands trembling at his sides. It was the first time Mason cried, not from pain or hunger, but from fear of his own father. That image carved itself into my heart permanently. That night, after Harold stormed off to sleep, snoring loudly from the whiskey he drank, I made my decision. I slipped out of bed, packed a small bag with clothes for Mason, a few essentials, and the money I had saved. I lifted Mason gently from his bed, whispering to him not to make a sound. He wrapped his arms around my neck sleepily, trusting me completely. It was nearly midnight when I stepped out the back door, the cool Indiana air striking my face as if welcoming me into a new world. My heart pounded, my breath shook, and every shadow looked like a threat. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. I walked away from that estate with Mason in my arms, my bruises still aching, fear clawing at my throat, but determination carrying my feet forward. I didn't know where we were going. I didn't know how far we could get. I didn't know whether we would make it through the night without being discovered. All I knew was that staying meant destroying both our lives. And so I walked. As long as I was moving, I believed there might still be hope. That night, the world felt impossibly wide, frighteningly dark, and yet for the first time in years full of possibility. That night was the first time I understood that survival sometimes begins not with a plan, but with the courage to run. I still remember the feeling of that first night on the run, the cold sting of the Indiana wind cutting across my face as I clutched little Mason tight against my chest. His small arms were wrapped around my neck, and even though he was half asleep, I could feel the tiny tremors in his body. He didn't understand why we were leaving, why his mother whispered urgent prayers under her breath, or why every sound in the darkness made me freeze. The night seemed endless. The shadows stretched like long fingers across the empty roads, and the silence felt heavier than anything I had ever carried. I moved quickly, terrified that Harold might wake early or notice our absence sooner than expected. Every few steps, I glanced back at the silhouette of the Whitmore estate shrinking behind us, the place that held so many memories of fear. For a moment, my legs faltered. This was the only home Mason had ever known, and I was walking him into a world of uncertainty. But then I remembered the expression on his face earlier that evening, the wide-eyed terror as he watched Harold's rage explode. That memory alone pushed me forward. I had planned our escape carefully, but even the most meticulous plans crumble when desperation and danger collide. My original intention was to reach a bus station several miles away, but with Mason asleep in my arms and the weight of my exhaustion pulling at me, I realized I wouldn't make it. I ducked into an abandoned barn just off the main road. Horses once lived there, judging by the old wooden stalls and faint smell of hay that lingered even after years of neglect. I laid Mason down on an old blanket I found in the corner, brushing his hair away from his forehead as he murmured softly in his sleep. For a brief moment, as he curled into the blanket, I allowed myself to sit beside him, my back pressed against the cold wall. I closed my eyes just long enough to whisper a promise to him that I would never, ever let Harold hurt him again. Before dawn broke, we were back on the road. I kept us far from the highways, choosing forested trails and dirt paths instead. I didn't know exactly where we were going, but somewhere deep in my heart, I believed the farther we got from Indiana, the safer we would be. Over the next few days, we moved through counties quickly, hitching rides with farmers, sleeping in cheap motels when I could afford it, and relying on strangers' kindness more often than I was comfortable with. We traveled west, my intuition guiding me even when the map felt meaningless. I picked Oregon not because I had any connection to it, but because I wanted a place Harold would never think to search our place as wild and remote as my desperation. When we finally crossed into Oregon, the first thing I noticed was the air. It smelled different, cleaner, sharper, almost ancient. The towering trees, with their dense green canopies, felt like guardians watching over us. For the first time since fleeing, I felt a flicker of hope. Mason held my hand tightly as we walked into a tiny mountain town that looked nothing like the polished streets of Harold's estate. Here, life was rugged and simple. People chopped their own firewood, grew their own vegetables, and patched their roofs with their own hands. It felt like the kind of place where a woman with secrets could simply blend in. We rented a one-room shack on the outskirts of town, using the last of my hidden money. It wasn't much, just a single bed, a small stove, a cracked window, and a floor that creaked with every step, but it was ours. No shouting. No footsteps storming down the hallway. No threats lurking behind closed doors. Mason adjusted quicker than I did. Children have a resilience adults often forget they once possessed. Within a week, he was playing with pine cones, chasing squirrels, and laughing again, an airy little laugh I hadn't heard in so long that it made my eyes well with tears. I found work wherever I could, cleaning cabins, washing dishes in the small diner, picking berries during harvest months. It was exhausting, but it was honest labor, and it gave me purpose. I felt myself healing in small, fragile ways. But healing is never linear. Just when you begin to feel safe, old fears creep back in, reminding you that your past still has claws. Rumors began circulating in the town, reports of wealthy men hiring private investigators, descriptions matching a woman with a young boy traveling through nearby counties. One afternoon, while I was sweeping the diner's front steps, I overheard two locals talking about search parties on horseback spotted deeper in the forest. My heart stopped. I didn't need confirmation. I knew it was Harold's doing. He had money, influence, and pride, and the combination of those three was deadly. He would never allow me to disappear quietly. I rushed home that evening with trembling hands. I packed essentials into a sack: water, bread, Mason's jacket, then threw dirt over the fire pit and grabbed my son's hand. We had to leave immediately, I told him. His small face twisted with confusion and fear, but he didn't resist. He sensed the urgency. We slipped into the forest just as twilight began settling over the trees. The deeper we walked, the more the forest swallowed us whole. Branches tore at my dress, roots threatened to trip us, and the shadows thickened until the world felt like a tunnel with no end. Behind us, in the distance, I heard barking sharp, aggressive, unmistakably trained dogs. The search party had arrived. I picked up Mason, stumbling through undergrowth, my breath coming in shallow gasps. Every step felt heavier, my legs screaming in pain, but adrenaline pushed me forward. Mason clung to me, burying his face into my shoulder, whispering, "Mommy, I'm scared." I told him to hold on, that we were almost safe, though in truth I didn't know where safety was anymore.
The barking grew louder.
Branches snapped behind us. Voices echoed through the forestmen calling orders to one another. My heart pounded so fiercely I could hear it in my ears.
Desperation clouded my mind.
If they caught us, Harold would drag us back, and I didn't know what fate awaited us then. Just when my legs buckled beneath me, and I sank to the forest floor with Mason protectively in my arms, something shifted in the darkness. A figure emerged, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a rough beard and eyes sharpened by the wilderness. I froze, unsure whether he was friend or foe.
Mason whimpered softly. The man raised his hands slowly, palms open.
His voice was low, steady, and carried a sincerity that cut through my panic. He told me he lived alone in these woods and had been observing the search party for hours. He had seen us running. He knew instantly we were the ones being hunted. And he wanted to help. His name was Caleb Rivers. Caleb didn't ask questions, didn't demand explanations. He scooped Mason into his arms and motioned for me to follow. Though my instincts urged caution, something about his presence grounded, steady, unthreatening made me trust him. He moved swiftly, guiding us through hidden trails only a seasoned woodsman would know. Eventually, he pushed aside a curtain of moss and revealed a narrow entrance to a cave concealed beneath thick ferns. Inside, it was surprisingly spacious, with remnants of fire pits, tools, and food supplies. Caleb covered the entrance with branches and instructed us to stay silent. Outside, the sound of barking grew closer, then circled, then drifted away. We held our breath until the forest became quiet again. That night, inside that cave, something extraordinary happened, not dramatic, not loud but life-changing. For the first time since fleeing Indiana, I slept without fear of Harold bursting through a door. Mason slept curled against me, his breathing calm, his dreams untroubled. In the flickering firelight, Caleb sat near the entrance, keeping watch without complaint. He didn't know us, and yet he protected us with a sense of duty that felt almost instinctive. When morning came, he brought water from a nearby stream, shared dried fish he had caught earlier in the week, and helped Mason carve a little wooden bird to calm his nerves. From that day on, Caleb became a permanent part of our lives. He guided us to a secluded clearing where he built a small hut for me and Mason from timber and branches. He taught me how to identify edible plants, how to track small game, and how to navigate the forest's hidden pathways. For Mason, he became the closest thing to a father he had ever known, gentle but firm, patient but wise. Mason adored him, and I, slowly but steadily, began to trust him in ways I hadn't trusted anyone in years. Living in the wilderness was hard, unpredictable, and often frightening, but it offered something I had never had before: freedom.
No footsteps echoing down hallways. No voices raised in anger.
No fear of doors slamming. The forest had become our sanctuary, and Caleb our unlikely guardian. And though I didn't know it then, the seeds of something deeper, something warm and healing had begun to take root between us. Those first months living under the protection of the Oregon wilderness felt like stepping into a different lifetime, one carved not of luxury or security, but of breath-by-breath survival and slowly blossoming peace. After years of smothering control, harsh discipline, and constant fear under Harold's roof, I found myself waking each morning to birdsong instead of shouting, to the rustle of wind through cedar branches instead of slamming doors, and to the soft sound of my son playing rather than crying. For the first time in years, my chest felt open, my lungs full, my heart carried by something gentler than dread. And standing at the center of this unlikely transformation was Caleb Rivers, the rugged woodsman who had appeared, it seemed, from the forest itself, strong as a pine root and quiet as falling snow. At first, I kept a wall between us, one built from memories of betrayal, fear, and the lingering sting of what my father and Harold had done to me. But Caleb never pushed. He was a man who understood silence, respected boundaries, and spoke only when words were needed. While I rebuilt my life one careful step at a time, Caleb continued to show up with small acts of kindness that felt like stitches, mending pieces of me I thought were damaged beyond repair. He brought Mason little treasures from the Forster smooth river stone shaped like a heart, feathers from a grouse, a carved wooden fox that quickly became my son's most prized possession. He taught him how to skip rocks, how to listen for the direction of the wind, and how to move through the forest with respect and awareness. Mason's laughter returned slowly at first, like a fragile melody, then grew fuller, freer, until he was running through the clearing with an energy I'd never seen in him before. Meanwhile, I worked tirelessly to create some semblance of home in the small hut Caleb had helped me build. It was rough, with uneven wooden walls and a roof patched with bark and moss, but every corner of that humble shelter felt safer than the grand Whitmore estate ever did. I arranged our few belongings in neat rows, fashioned shelves from driftwood, stitched blankets from fabric scraps, and turned a hollowed log into a stool. As I worked, Caleb often passed by, sometimes offering advice on weatherproofing the roof, sometimes dropping off fresh firewood, sometimes simply leaving food, a handful of berries, a fish he had caught, a loaf of bread he had traded for in town. He never asked for anything in return. His generosity felt unhurried, natural, like sunlight slowly warming a room. And gradually, without either of us acknowledging it, we began building a rhythm together. He would split wood in the mornings while I fetched water from the stream. I cooked whatever simple meals I could, and he sat with us near the fire each evening, telling stories in his deep, steady voice, stories of mountain storms, of fishing trips gone wrong, of strange animal tracks he'd spotted on rare nights. Mason listened wide-eyed, drinking in every word, while I found myself watching Caleb instead of the flames, studying the quiet strength in his profile, the way his eyes softened when Mason laughed, the gentleness in his movements despite his rugged exterior. But healing does not come without its shadows. Many nights, long after Mason had fallen asleep beside me, I lay awake staring at the roof, listening to the whispering wind. The ghosts of my past crept in through the cracks: me father's cold indifference, Harold's explosive temper, Benjamin's devastated expression when he believed the worst of me. I wondered if I deserved peace after everything that had happened, or if someday Harold's cruelty would find its way back to us. In those dark moments, fear gripped me so tightly that I sometimes sat upright, breath quickened, heart racing. On more than one occasion, Caleb noticed. He wouldn't approach immediately, but he'd remain nearby, stoking the fire, humming softly, waiting until my breathing steadied before offering a gentle word or simply his presence. He didn't push me to open up. He didn't demand explanations. He understood that scars take time to trust the warmth of healing. One autumn afternoon, while Mason played near the stream chasing dragonflies, Caleb asked me to walk with him deeper into the forest. The leaves were turning gold and amber, crunching beneath our boots. He led me to a ridge overlooking a valley painted in fire-colored treetops, the kind of view that steals your breath and leaves you grateful just to be alive long enough to witness it. There, Caleb finally spoke about himself, not much, but enough to let me glimpse his own wounds. He told me about losing his parents young, about growing up under the care of a harsh uncle who valued labor more than affection, and how he eventually left everything behind to carve out a life alone in the wilderness. His solitude had been both his shield and his prison. Listening to him, I realized that we were both people shaped by pain, people who had fled something destructive in search of freedom. And yet, standing there with the wind lifting my hair, with Caleb's steady presence beside me, I felt something shift, a sense of belonging I hadn't felt since before my father tore my life apart. Winter arrived swiftly in the mountains, blanketing the ground in thick snow. Life grew harder, gathering wood became urgent, food scarcer, nights longer and colder. But the cold also brought us closer. Caleb reinforced our hut with extra logs, built a stone-lined fire pit, and even carved a wooden door strong enough to keep out the biting wind. He brought Mason a fur-lined coat and spent hours teaching him how to read animal tracks in the snow. And on nights when the storm outside howled so fiercely it rattled the shutters, Caleb stayed awake, ensuring our fire never burned out. Slowly, the fear that once clung to me loosened its grip. One evening, as I stirred a pot of stew over the fire, Caleb stood beside me, brushing a stray lock of hair from my face. His hand lingered gently at my cheek, and I felt something bloom inside, mesomething, tender, unexpected, and terrifying in its sweetness. I had believed love was forever lost to me, shattered beyond repair. But Caleb didn't try to fill the space Benjamin once occupied. Instead, he created a new one, quiet, sturdy, and built with patience. In the spring, when the snows melted and green returned to the forest, Caleb asked me, in his simple, earnest way, if I would consider making a life with him, not out of obligation, not from loneliness, but because he cared for me deeply and believed he could give Mason the kind of father every boy deserved. I didn't answer immediately. My heart was still learning to trust its own desires again. But the next morning, as I watched Caleb teaching Mason how to whittle a stick into a toy boat, something inside me settled. I realized that safety wasn't a distant dream. It was right there, in the clearing where my son laughed freely, in the steady hands of a man who asked for nothing but honesty, in the soft morning light that fell over our little hut. Later that summer, we exchanged simple vows beneath a ring of fir trees. No witnesses, no grand ceremony, just the three of us and the rustle of leaves. Caleb slipped a small wooden ring onto my finger, carved by his own hands, and I felt as though my heart, after years of suffering, had finally found a place to rest. Mason clapped with excitement, running around us in circles. And there, in the quiet of that forest, I began a new chapter, one built not by force or manipulation, but by choice. By freedom. By love earned through gentleness. Life with Caleb was not luxurious, but it was peaceful in a way I had never known before. We built a routine together, chopping wood, tending to our small vegetable patch, sharing meals cooked over open flame, telling stories near the fire. Mason thrived. His nightmares faded. His laughter echoed through the forest like a song of renewal. And for the first time in years, when I looked at my reflection in the water, I recognized the woman staring back at me, a woman who had survived darkness and found warmth again. I believed then, with all my heart, that the past had finally released its grip. That the pain my father and Harold inflicted had been washed away by time, distance, and the powerful love growing in our little family. But life has a way of reminding us that even when we outrun the shadows, they often linger just beyond the treeline, waiting for the moment to reappear. And though I didn't know it at the time, a single encounter from my Patan, unexpected face returning after decades, would test everything I had rebuilt. My peace. My faith. My understanding of love. As the years folded gently into one another like pages turned by a slow, thoughtful hand, life settled into a rhythm so peaceful that I sometimes forgot the world had ever held darkness for me. Mason grew tall and strong, his shoulders broadening with the honest labor of mountain living. Caleb remained the steadfast foundation of our small family, a man whose presence was as solid as the ancient fir trees that towered over our clearing. And I, Eleanor Brooks, once a frightened, broken girl, had become a woman who finally understood what it meant to be safe. But even the most tranquil lives have moments that stir old memories, and fate has a curious way of presenting them when you least expect it. Mine arrived on a misty autumn afternoon, decades after my escape, when the leaves had turned amber and the air carried the scent of rain-soaked earth. That day, I was tending to my small stand in the County Market, a humble setup with jars of berry preserves, bundles of herbs, hand-carved trinkets Caleb had crafted, and knitted scarves I made during long winter evenings. My life no longer required much, and what I had was enough. I had peace, a husband who cherished me, and a son who respected the strength I fought so hard to reclaim. But as I reached to stack a row of homemade candles, I sensed movement at the edge of the wooden awning.
A silhouette stepped out of the rain.
I froze. The figure was thin, shoulders slightly hunched, his coat worn from years of travel. Drops of rain clung to his dark hair, now streaked with gray. When he lifted his face, the market sounds faded around me like a distant dream.
I heard only the thudding of my own heart.
It was Benjamin Clark. Time had carved new lines across his features. His once fiery eyes had dimmed, replaced by a depth that spoke of years spent in regret and wandering. His hands, those same hands that had once held mine by the riverbank, were rougher now, weathered by long days and longer nights. For a moment, he just stared at me, disbelief flickering across his face as though he wasn't sure if I was real. I felt rooted to the ground, unable to move, unable to breathe. Memories came rushing back like a river that had been dammed for too long, the summer evenings filled with laughter, the promises whispered beneath Indiana moonlight, the heartbreak etched into his voice when he believed the worst of me. I thought I had buried those memories deep beneath the layers of my new life, but seeing him again unearthed everything in a single breath. When Benjamin finally spoke, his voice trembled slightly, not from weakness but from the weight of years pressing against the moment. He said my name, Alina, softly, like a word he had carried inside him for decades. Hearing it from him again made something inside my chest tighten painfully, not with longing, but with the bittersweetness of a life that could never be reclaimed. I invited him to sit beneath the shelter of my stand, offering him a stool I used on long market days. He hesitated, as though unsure he deserved even that small kindness. But eventually he sat, his shoulders sagging with exhaustion and emotion. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The patter of rain filled the silence, and Mason's distant laughter drifted from a nearby stall where he was helping a neighbor load hay. Life had continued, blossomed even, and yet here was a fragment of my past, alive and unexpected. Finally, Benjamin began to talk. He told me he had spent years searching for me, moving from state to state on bits of rumor, fading trails, and stories shared by travelers who claimed to recognize my description. After he walked away from me all those years ago, he had tried to bury his guilt, convincing himself he had done the right thing by distancing himself from what he assumed was betrayal. But as time passed, and truth seeped into the cracks of his assumptions, he began to understand that he had wronged Medhat, he had abandoned someone who needed him most. He said that each realization came like a blow, shattering the certainty he once clung to. He told me he had never married, never settled, never stopped wondering what had become of me or whether I had found safety. I listened quietly, hands folded in my lap, my breath steady but fragile. I wished I could tell him none of what happened had shaped me, that I had moved on without scars, but that wouldn't have been true. So instead, I told him my story, not the short, polite version I sometimes offered strangers, but the raw truth. I told him about my father's betrayal, the forced marriage, the years of cruelty, the night Mason and I escaped, and the terror of being hunted. I spoke carefully, not out of fear but because the memories themselves were delicate, like glass fragments I had learned to handle without bleeding. Benjamin didn't interrupt once. His eyes glistened, his jaw clenched, his breath uneven. When I finally told him about Caleb, the man who rescued us, who gave Mason a father, and who gave me a life defined not by fear but by love, Benjamin closed his eyes and let a single tear fall. Not from jealousy, not from anger, but from understanding. He apologized then, not with rushed words or excuses, but with a sincerity that carried the weight of 40 years. He said he wished he had been stronger, braver, more willing to trust the girl he loved. He said he had spent half his life punishing himself for walking away. As he spoke, I felt no anger toward him. The Eleanor who might have resented him had long since shed her bitterness. The path life forced me onto had been painful, terrifying, but it had also led me to Caleb, to Mason's safety, and to a strength I didn't know lived inside me. Looking at Benjamin, I realized that had he stayed, had he believed me all those years ago, the trajectory of my life would have been drastically different. Maybe better in some ways, but maybe not. Because without the suffering, without the courage to flee, without the wilderness, I would never have found the quiet, unwavering love that became the foundation of my later years. Everything had unfolded as it needed to, even if the journey was brutal. We spoke for a long time, two old friends walking carefully through memories that once threatened to destroy us. When the rain finally eased, Benjamin stood. There was a heaviness to him, but also a release, as though speaking the truth aloud had freed him from a lifetime of carrying regrets. He looked at me with an expression I can only describe as a mixture of love and acceptance, the final soft glow of something that once burned brightly. He said he knew he had come too late. He said he understood that Caleb was my true partner, the man destiny had chosen for me when everything else fell apart. And then he did something I never expected. He thanked me. Thanked me for surviving. Thanked me for living long enough for him to apologize. Thanked me for giving him a chance to make peace with himself. Before he left, Benjamin asked to see Mason from a distance, not to speak to him, not to explain himself, but simply to witness the life I had built from ruins. I nodded. He watched my son, now a grown man, laughing with a friend, unaware of the chapter from my past standing only yards away. Benjamin smiled softly, the kind of smile made of equal parts sorrow and gratitude. Then he turned to me one last time. He took my hands gently in his touch warm but trembling. He told me he would carry the memory of our young love not as a wound, but as a reminder that even the brightest flames can be extinguished by circumstances beyond one's control. He said, "Be happy, Eleanor. Truly happy. I don't want anything more than that." I told him I was. And I was not lying. As he walked away, disappearing into the thinning curtain of rain, I felt neither heartbreak nor longing. Only closure. Only peace. It was like watching the final chapter of an unfinished book finally being written, the ending settling neatly into place after decades of suspense. When Caleb arrived to help me pack up my stand, I leaned into him, resting my head against his shoulder. He didn't ask what was wrong or who had come. He simply held me, as he always did, with the unspoken understanding that whatever storms I weathered before meeting him no longer had the power to shake me. That evening, sitting beside the fire in our cabin, with Mason playing his guitar and Caleb tending the flames, I felt the full arc of my life settle into balance. I realized that every moment of suffering, every tear shed, every mile traveled in fear, had led me to a place where love was gentle, where safety was tangible, where my son grew into a man shaped not by trauma but by tenderness. And I understood, as clearly as the crackling firelight before me, that the past doesn't disappear, it transforms. It becomes the soil from which new futures grow. Now, at 70 years old, as I recount my story, I do not tremble from grief. I speak with strength, for I survived what was meant to break me, and I built a life rich with redemption. My journey was not easy, not fair, not kind. But it brought me to where I was always meant to be. And that, in the end, is enough.